Hey guys, welcome to the Bourboneering podcast. I'm your host, Austin. This is another episode of study sessions. We're going back to the basics with what is whiskey and what is bourbon. Today's episode is the smack daddy of them all. What is bourbon? So, this whole series was inspired by one of my friends asking me, what is the difference between whiskey and bourbon? Now, I thought everyone knew the difference. Or at least, people who enjoy whiskey and enjoy bourbon. This guy loves whiskey. He just got into it, but he's loving whiskey. And he didn't know the difference. So I decided that I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to at least learn what the difference is between whiskey and bourbon. And that is, there's no difference. Bourbon is whiskey. But bourbon is a very specific type of whiskey. It's just like saying a Labrador Retriever is a dog, but not all dogs are Labrador Retrievers. There's different breeds of dogs. There's different breeds of whiskey. And the first one we're going to talk about is bourbon. I'm also going to talk about Scotch, rye, corn whiskey, Canadian whiskey, malt whiskey, all that. But today is bourbon. So I'm going to read you the legal definition of bourbon, and I'm going to give it to you in layman's terms. The legal definition of bourbon as laid out in the Federal Standards of Identity for Distilled Spirits codified under 27 CFR 5.22 B1I. Bourbon must be produced in the United States, be made from a grain mixture that is at least 51% corn, aged in new charred oak containers, distilled no more than 160 proof, 80% alcohol by volume, entered into the container for aging at no more than 125 proof, 62.5% alcohol by volume, and bottled like other whiskeys at 80 proof or more, 40% alcohol by volume. Bourbon has no minimum specified duration for its aging period. Products aged for as little as 3 months are sold as bourbon. All right, so then it goes into all the codifiers and different labels of bourbon. But basically, the big difference between bourbon and other whiskeys in the United States is the 51% corn. Rye, spoiler alert for the next episode, is at least 51% rye. Bourbon is at least 51% corn. But on top of that, like I just read, there's a limit for which the proof that it can be distilled at, which for whiskey, if you listen to last episode, can be distilled up until 190 proof, whereas bourbon can only be distilled up to 100 or 80% alcohol, which is 160 proof. And going into the barrel, you have to water it down more, and it can only be 125 proof or lower. Now, I have an episode explaining the difference between barrel proof, full proof, and all that. The full proof is the 125 proof that it goes into the barrel at. Listen to that episode for more details on barrel entry and all that. Basically, that's the biggest limits on bourbon as far as before it gets aged. Another one of the biggest components of bourbon is it must be aged in new charred oak containers. Now, most people think of barrels, and that's what most people age their bourbon in. But it has to be new oak. It can't be used. It can't be used to just hold other spirits. It can't be used to hold other things like honey. It can't be used to hold anything. That's why a lot of scotches are aged in ex-bourbon barrels, because once they're used once, they can't be used again for bourbon, or at least not for the original maturation of bourbon. So that's the biggest thing. Also, one thing that I didn't know until recently is there's no age limit on bourbon. It could literally be in a container for 2 seconds, 5 seconds. And I believe Pabst Blue Ribbon made a bourbon, there's air quotes there, that was aged for, I believe, 5 seconds in a oak container. Obviously, you can't use the oak container again, but it's technically bourbon. And I hear it's not that good, which makes sense. Other things to consider for bourbon is, just like other whiskey, it can't be below 40% in the bottle. You can't add anything to bourbon. You can't add any coloring. The only thing you can add is water. Can't add flavors, can't add coloring. Now, I'm going to go in a little bit of detail about the different type of labels for bourbon, but I'm going to do a whole label episode later on for study sessions in this series. But basically, bourbon does not need an age statement to be considered bourbon. As long as it meets all the other requirements, does not need an age statement. If it's straight bourbon, it has to be at least 2 years old, and if there's no age statement on the straight bourbon, it's at least 4 years old. Bottled and bond bourbon must be, amongst other things, at least 4 years old. And Kentucky straight bourbon or Louisiana straight bourbon means it was made in that state. Bourbon can be made anywhere in the United States, anywhere in the U.S. Doesn't have to be Kentucky. Kentucky makes some really, really good bourbon, makes a lot of bourbon, makes most of the really good bourbon, but it does not have to be in Kentucky. Basically, anything else, if it doesn't meet those standards, it can still be considered whiskey. It could still be really, really good, but it's not bourbon. Oak containers, another word I want to mention is it doesn't have to be a barrel. It's usually a barrel. It doesn't have to be a barrel. It can be a huge oak vat. It can be a small oak bucket. Doesn't matter. You can't, now, it does matter for the flavor, but for the consideration of it being bourbon, doesn't matter. So bourbon is very strict, yet has many loopholes, if you will. But it ensures a product that you know what you're getting. I wouldn't say consistent product because bourbon's very every day, different distillery, everything. Bourbon is very not consistent, but it's a product you know you're getting at least a certain quality of. And that's the reason for a lot of these legalization of types of whiskey. Scotch is very, very strict on what can be considered Scotch, different things like that. But that's all I have on bourbon. If you have any more questions, please let me know. Look at my Instagram, DM me. I'll be happy to answer your questions. All right, let's get to a bourbon review right now. Hey guys, Austin here with Bourboneering to talk about Prestige decanters. Prestige is where I get my whiskey tasting glasses for all my podcasts. I do all my reviews with these glasses. They're a beautiful tulip shape. They also have a lot of fun rocks glasses and things like that, as well as beautiful decanters like their name suggests. Use the link in the description below and use promo code Bourboneering, and you can get 8% off your order at Prestige. It helps the show out, it helps you out, and helps them out. So check them out when you get a chance, and thanks for listening. Alright guys, today we're reviewing a very classic bourbon. This is Old Forester's 86 proof bourbon, their basic release. Old Forester is a brand that's been, as a tout, sold continuously before, during, and after Prohibition. It is the first bottled bourbon. Before that, stores would get casks of bourbon and you fill your own bottles up. So that's a pretty cool little history note there. But, this is a bottom shelf bourbon. It's cheap, and under $10 where I got it, I do believe. Maybe under $15. It's 86 proof, so it's right above, your baseline 40% alcohol. Let's give it a shot here. All right, on the nose, it's sharp on the nose. It's ethanol-y, but also got a cinnamon spice that I'm not digging. It's not a classic bourbon cinnamon. Has a little bit of that cheap banana note. Lots of vanilla. It's got different flavors. It's definitely a little bit more layered than the Jack Daniels I had last week, but it's not as pleasant. A lot better on the taste. I wouldn't call it smooth. It's got some spikes to it from the ethanol, but it's a lot sweeter. It's got some more classic bourbon. I get a little bit of oak. Like it's been in the barrel. It's got some oak to it. A lot less banana. A little bit of peanut butter. I kind of like it. It's spiky. It has some downsides, a little bit of off taste, but it's pretty good. Finish is relatively short. I keep going back to the sip, and it's still got a spikiness to it that I'm not a huge fan of. I'm going to have to give this a 2.5. It was good. It's right on the average mark, but it's going to be a 2.5 out of 5. All right, guys, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on the next episode of Study Sessions. Thanks for listening, guys. If you enjoyed the podcast, make sure you subscribe on whichever player you're using. Leave a comment and leave a 5-star review if you can. Once you've done that, go follow me on Instagram at Bourboneering or on Twitter at InBourbon, or go like our Facebook page, Bourboneering. All this, as well as my Prestige Decanter affiliate link and a link to sign up for a weekly newsletter, are all below. Thanks for listening, everybody. Cheers.